Okay, so now that we've covered chemistry and how it pertains to human life, we can build on that by discussing cellular structure and function. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in the body. And what I mean by that is cells are the brick and mortar of the human body. All the organs in the body are made of tissues. Those tissues are made of cells. And those cells have different shapes and functions. For instance, when we say the liver is secreting bile, we mean the cells of the liver secrete bile. And the organ of the liver is made of these tiny units called cells. What we're looking at here is a generic representation of a cell because different cells have different shapes depending on their function. A hepatocyte liver cell will look different from an osteocyte, which is a bone cell. Cyte meaning cell here, we will discuss various types of cells as we go throughout the course. So just be aware, we may look at a cell model like this one to get a grasp on some of the structures inside, but this is simply a representation of the many types of cells in the human body. So when we talk about cells, most of them share similar characteristics, such as possessing a cellular plasma membrane, but they all have different shapes that correspond to the function they perform in the body. The function of any given cell is determined by the structure of that cell. If we consider the difference between a neuron and a skin cell, the neuron can be shaped like a star with dendritic processes up to a meter long that live potentially for the entire lifetime of an organism. Whereas in the skin cell's case, it can be shaped like a flat plate and live for a short time before it is shed and replaced. So each type of cell has a given function that is determined by its structure. This is important for the entirety of this class, so keep it in mind as we progress throughout the different concepts. So, there are a few characteristics that all of our cells have in common. The plasma membrane separates the intracellular fluid from the extracellular fluid. So, the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. The cytoplasm is the cell-forming material. Most cellular activities are going to end up happening in here. The cytosol is the fluid-like gel that gives the cell its shape. It consists of water, protein, salt, sugar, and a variety of other solutes as well. The cytoskeleton is the supportive framework of the cell. It is made up of microfilaments, intermediate filaments, and microtubules, which provide the scaffolding to support the cell structure and also aids in some mobility as well. Cytoplasmic inclusions are not organelles, but are chemicals that may or may not be present in every cell, such as stored nutrients, glycogen granules in liver and muscle cells, fat droplets in fat cells, melanin granules, like certain skin and hair cells, or water vacuoles. Lastly, there are various organelles present throughout each cell, such as mitochondria. Each organelle has a unique function that contributes to the cell's overall function, and we will go through these more in detail as we progress throughout the various organ systems. Okay, all of our cells communicate with each other in an organized system to maintain homeostasis, the balancing act done by the body to ensure stability and quality of life is called homeostasis. When we look at the cell, they're bathed in a fluid. They're in a fluid environment and communicating with each other through what is called the internal environment. The body fluid is contained in a couple different spaces that we will get into more here shortly, though. So there are multiple functions of the cell, and like I kind of said before, there are multiple types of cells, so not all cells are going to do all of these things necessarily, but for the most part, these are general functions that we can see in cells. So one being obtaining nutrients and oxygen from the environment outside the cell. Another one being perform chemical reactions to provide energy for a cell, like using food and oxygen and making carbon dioxide, water, and energy out of that. We eliminate wastes and carbon dioxide to the environment outside the cell. Cells also control the exchange of materials between the cell and its surroundings. They move materials within the cell in the case of sperm. Cells need to be able to sense and respond to changes in their environment, such as immune cells, being able to sense that there's a pathogen and they need to take care of that by getting rid of it. Cells reproduce or mitotically divide. This doesn't necessarily happen in nerve cells or muscle cells. If you think of it in the case of neurons, they don't mitotically divide. They just die whenever we have like a stroke. So if we do have a stroke, those neurons that do die never come back. Rather, if it's bad enough, severe brain damage can occur. But our neurons are made via neurogenesis, from stem cells. So we can produce new neurons, but they're not mitotically dividing. Same case of muscle cells; these just grow with us. And then cells also synthesize molecules like ATP, protein, lipids, and other molecules as well. Okay, so the internal environment is the inside or the out, like whatever the cell is interacting with. So this fluid inside the body has different compartments. Any fluid outside the cell is called the interstitial fluid because it's the fluid that the cells are bathed in. So it's between the cells, like between each other, between the cells. So if it's a fluid inside the blood vessels, we call that plasma. And together, these make up the extracellular fluid that surrounds cells. This is the internal environment of the body that the cells are interacting with. Again, the extracellular fluid is that internal environment. So the fluid inside cells is called an intracellular fluid. Intra meaning inside. Extracellular fluid is outside the cell. Extra meaning outside, like extraterrestrial life that we find outside this planet. Like we said on the last slide, the extracellular fluid consists of the plasma and interstitial fluid. Inter meaning between, like interstate highways that cross state borders, or international travel between countries. Believe it or not, the bulk of our water volume is actually stored in our cells in the intracellular fluid. When we get dehydrated, we lose water from the interstitial compartment first, and then it moves into our plasma. When this happens, the blood pressure drops, and the heart has to work harder to get oxygen to the tissues that need it. And so the heart has to start beating faster. This is hallmarked in severe dehydration. We see blood pressure drop and the heart rate go up. And so again, most of the water in our body resides in the intracellular fluid here, inside the cells. So the plasma membrane separates that intracellular and extracellular environment. But it also plays a key role in other aspects of cellular physiology. Peppered throughout the bilayer, we can find various proteins and lipids. We can find integral membrane proteins that span across the entirety of the lipid bilayer, like channel proteins that form a literal channel. Again, these are literal channels that allow ions or other substances to pass through them selectively. Other integral membrane proteins can be cell recognition proteins like receptors, which selectively bind to a specific molecule outside the cell to cause a chemical reaction inside the cell. A ligand would be the molecule that binds to the receptor and activates it. Some integral membrane proteins even serve dual roles as both a receptor and an ion channel. The ligand would bind to the receptor and change its shape and open up a channel in that, allowing certain substances to pass through that channel. We'll see this in nerve cells when a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor on the outside of the cell membrane, causing an ion channel to open and allow ions to pass through. This is needed since the lipid bilayer is selectively permeable, meaning that only certain substances can pass through that membrane freely. Substances that can pass through freely are relatively small, non-polar molecules that can pass through the non-polar lipid bilayer. These are lipid-soluble molecules. Other lipids, oxygen and carbon dioxide, can all pass through freely. They are lipid-soluble. Water-soluble molecules need assistance to pass through as they are repelled by hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid bilayer. So there's also glycoproteins, which are sugar molecules attached to proteins, and glycolipids, which are sugar molecules attached to the phospholipid head regions. These glycolipids and glycoproteins make up the glycocalyx, which allows cells to bind to and recognize one another. This is unique per individual and aids in promoting an immune response when pathogens like viruses are not recognized by the glycocalyx. And then peripheral membrane proteins are those that we find on one side of the bilayer, usually attached to another protein, such as like an integral membrane protein. For instance, the peripheral cells on the surface of intestinal cells act as digestive enzymes that break down nutrients into sizes that can pass through cells and into the bloodstream. Oops, I did not want to go past that yet. Okay. So, and then lastly, there's another structure that I wanted to chat about called cholesterol. It's a steroid. This provides rigidity to the plasma membrane, and the lipid bilayer would be too fluid if not for cholesterol, providing some structural integrity to the oily bilayer. All right, so then we call the plasma membrane a fluid-mosaic model since it consists of a variety of macromolecules like protein, lipid, and carbohydrates. And it's fluid because the embedded proteins in the membrane can move around throughout the membrane like they're swimming in a pool. There's a video in the extra study materials for this week that explains this fluid mosaic model of the plasma membrane if you want a little bit more information on this aspect. But what I really need you to know is that lipids and proteins can move throughout the membrane because it's not solid. And it's considered a mosaic because there's a variety of proteins that can be moving through there. So plasma membrane, also known as the phospholipid bilayer, is what separates the intracellular fluid of the cell and the extracellular fluid outside the cell. It's called the phospholipid bilayer because it consists of 2 layers of phospholipids. All right, 2 layers here, bi. A phospholipid is a phosphate attached to a glycerol molecule that's attached to 2 fatty acid tails. All right, so the phosphate and glycerol make up the hydrophilic head, which is water-loving, water-loving head, and the hydrophobic tails. So hydro, water, phobic, fearing, hydrophobic, water-fearing tails. The hydrophobic ends don't want to be near the water that's in the extracellular or the intracellular environments, so they point inwardly on each other, and the hydrophilic regions are going to be on the outside because they want to be by the water, so they point outwardly. So cholesterol determines fluidity of the membrane, like I was kind of chatting about before. There's a hydroxyl group, the OH here, that makes the head of the molecule polar and hydrophilic, meaning water-loving. So it's attracted to the phosphate heads of the periphery of the membrane on those phospholipids. The carbon rings, not classified as a fat or oil, so cholesterol is a steroid. And then the non-polar hydrophobic tail is going to be attracted to the hydrophobic tails of the phospholipids in the center of the membrane. So these embed perfectly with those phospholipids so that they can help provide rigidity and stability to the cell membrane. Without it, the membrane would collapse on itself.